Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tyler Schmidt. I'm a user experience designer and consultant, and I'm currently contributing to the Twitter decentralized Twitter application for Blockstack. So I've been using this methodology of design thinking for the past 8 years to solve really complex problems. And today I want to share that toolkit with you guys today. So the name of this talk is Solving the Right Problem, and that's essentially what all this is about. It's about identifying the right problem and identifying a solution. I'll take questions afterwards. So I'm Tyler. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Tyler Schmidt. So what is design thinking exactly? Well, design thinking is both a mindset and a toolkit for solving complex problems. And it's about one thing in particular that's incredibly important, and that is a focus on the end user. You want to leverage people in order to make more informed decisions about your problems. So the way that we do this, the way that we focus on this end user, is by leveraging empathy, the emotional aspects of any interaction. And this is incredibly important because an A/B test may only give you so much about the quantitative back end of what you're going to functionally improve on your system. But if you look at the real user and try and understand what they're going through and what they're feeling by putting yourself in their shoes, you're going to gain much more impactful and more beneficial insights than you may otherwise have by simply running a quantitative analysis. So the cryptographic space is a really interesting space right now. The technology is evolving. There's a massive wave of innovation in the space. But in my opinion, a great technology does not equal a great product. So instead of that, I believe creating a great product means solving the right problem. And identifying that is also a key aspect as well. You can be pushing a technology forward in one direction, but it could be an entirely different direction than the actual market demand. So what are the contents then of a successful product? To me, it's really three-factor. And don't just take my word for it. Also take Tom Kelly's word from IDEO. He's kind of the authority on this as well. But it's really threefold. It's feasibility, viability, and desirability. So the feasibility is essentially the technology. How is the technology progressing? Is there something that exists that's actually useful and usable and actually generating some form of value? The second piece is the viability. And that's the marketplace. So that's the ability for this technology to exist within some kind of an ecosystem that will perpetuate it forward. Okay? And we've seen a lot of really good news in this cryptographic asset space, in the decentralized space recently, with the SEC rulings that have just come out. So this is basically all establishing a very, very viable marketplace for all this cryptographic technology that we're currently working on. But the third aspect is desirability. And this is the human aspect. This is the aspect of what we're emotionally interested in. Why is someone going to come to this experience in the first place? I mean, if the switching cost for most technology these days is zero or essentially negligible, there has to be some kind of an emotional equivalent that you need to add to your experience. Otherwise, people aren't going to be drawn in the first place. And I believe that it's the synthesis of these three attributes that truly makes for a great, impactful product that will break through, not simply technology alone. So this methodology of design thinking is a great way for us to leverage more desirability. I believe that the desirability aspect of the cryptographic technology distributed system space is extremely underemphasized currently. But that ends as of today. As of today, we're going to start adding more design thinking, more considerations to the end user. And I want to share with you guys a number of the tools that I've used throughout the years in order to do this. Design thinking isn't just a mindset. It's also a methodology. And it has a playbook. And today I want to share with you the favorite pieces of my playbook. So all of you that are here today, you're actually going to get some real actionable stuff out of sitting through my talk. So these aspects are the persona, the user journey, the mental model, and the rapid prototype. And all four of these are extremely important because they create central sources of truth, they create validation on top of them, and they create a positive feedback loop. And you'll see how that works in a second. So let's first talk about the persona. The persona is the ideal representation of the user. Now, if you're working on a product, sometimes you're solving a problem simply for yourself. And I've seen a lot of very good products come about from this kind of work. But usually the use cases are small, and you want to make sure you have at least 1,000 people who also come across the same problem you have. But in much larger cases where you want to have a widespread product or something that will scale, you need to start considering who your users are. So the persona answers a number of questions for you. Who are your users? How do they feel about the product? And what need are they trying to solve by interacting with your product in the first place? And by having a central source of truth, you're basically creating a representation of who that user may be. And this is essentially a human factor that you can reference and utilize when you're in any conversation about a product or technology you're trying to build. So if you have this persona, it's not necessarily just a user at this point, it's really a reference guide. It's like, it's not Alice or Bob from the cryptographic analogies, it's, my friend Jack, who, has X, Y, or Z problem in his daily life that he's trying to solve. And when you're trying to debate, like, oh, well, maybe we want this feature set added, maybe we want this feature set removed, things like this, there can be a lot of technical disagreements in the process of design and making things. But everyone can agree upon humans. And then this way, you actually have a source of user advocacy. The persona is your essential piece of user advocacy. You can point to that and get a good piece of validation on what that person may be thinking about. So you can always look back to that persona whenever you're making an informed decision about adding something to your feature set. So once you have a persona in place, usually you have a really good understanding of the needs of your users. You have at least an understanding of what they're looking for. And this is point A in a user journey. And point B is essentially having those needs resolved and having them solved. But the nexus of interaction is basically the point, the in-between space. And that's the user journey. So the user journey is really a snapshot of a core piece of functionality within your system. So don't do the whole thing, but you could do like onboarding, for example, or more importantly, just core interactions on your platform. So go from the point of user A, point A, I have a need, to point B, I have an end solution, and then map out all the steps that go from there. So the key thing to notice here is that you don't want to use the technical aspects of the product. The point of the journey you want to make is the actual user steps. And this way, you can get a lot of optimization out of the process. So it's not just how the system changes from one state to the other, it's how your persona goes from one stage of the interaction to the next. Now, most user journeys are actually quite simple. Again, they only cover like a core feature or aspect. And they're only going to be a couple of states. Most of the time, they're actually quite linear with a few branches for different outcomes for different users. But they're usually not overly complex. And by doing this exercise, by mapping out the user journey, you're going to find out a lot more things that you may not have realized about your product. So this goes back to identifying and solving the right problem. By mapping out this journey, you may find that there are friction points in your ecosystem. There may be areas where your users are confused, where they may not necessarily understand the exact piece of feedback that they're looking for, or areas where they're just getting frustrated because they're not following through with the action the right way. So these are all basically friction points that you can easily identify and then optimize for. So overall, the user journey is just a great way to streamline any kind of experience from a user-focused standpoint. So they also do one other really great thing, which is if you build a number of these, because a lot of products have multiple different use cases, you can then start to wrap them all together and use that to map out the functional ecosystem for your product. So once you have a set of these user journeys, you've kind of got a map of what the functional representation of your system is. Like what are the needs that are being served by your system. So once you have this great user journey in place that's going to be a functional representation of those needs, you can then start to go ahead and concept around what it is that is that value. And this comes in the next piece of the toolkit, and that's the mental model. The mental model is essentially just a metaphor for a complex system. And a lot of times there are multiple types of mental models. So the designers and developers usually create one type of mental model, and that's their impression of what the system is when they're creating it for the first time. But users also come to experience with their own mental model. And that's just their expectation for what the system may be based on whatever has been in the environment to inform them prior to them actually interacting with the system in the first place. And that, in many ways, comes into conflict with the image of the actual designer. So this is like a classic UX design diagram 101. And it's essentially the fact that there's essentially divergence. But this comes back to the idea of focusing on the user. The mental model, this metaphor, is going to assign value and the context within which the user can operate within a given system. So focusing on the mental model is something that's extremely important. And I can't emphasize enough how important the mental model is. Because it's the lowest valence, lowest friction way to input information in the user about the value of the system that they're about to interact with. Now, Shapeshift is actually a great example of this. The mental model of Shapeshift is right in the name itself. And if you're not familiar, Shapeshift is essentially one of the leading currency exchanges for non-fiat cryptographic currency. But all they do is change currency from one asset class to the other. And they do it extremely quickly, and everything about their interface, everything about their design just perpetuates that idea. It's the first thing you see when you go to their homepage, and their API is all about just transferring currency. So if you get the mental model in place, you'll easily see how quickly people can quickly pick up and understand what it is that your service is useful for. So you have a mental model now through a fun brainstorming exercise, hopefully, and you've generated your persona where you understand who the users are, and you now have a journey that they follow along. Now you're ready to rapid prototype, and this is personally one of my favorite parts of the experience as well. So rapid prototyping isn't necessarily just going in and hacking on code to get an MVP up ready right away. It's also not going into Sketch or going into Illustrator and defining a beautiful user interface. It's going to pen and paper and just sketching things out on paper as quickly as you possibly can. So you have a user journey, you can simply follow that, and you create a rapid prototype around your ideal user journey. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a wireframe, it doesn't have to be boxes and arrows on an interface. We're much further along with user experience design than that. We're now at the point where context, invisible interfaces, these things are all extremely important topics that we need to consider. So UX is a lot more about removing things from the experience than it is adding. And this is because user experience design is essentially all about reducing cognitive load to the end user. If I could say anything else today about what UX is, it's just that. Reduce cognitive load to the end user. That is the most important thing that the function of UX does, but it's also just done in a lot of different words. So essentially with rapid prototyping, just make sure that you sketch it all out. Because then, once you have this in place, you now have a central source of truth. Again, just like the persona that you can validate. Because that's the most wonderful part about design thinking in this toolkit. This rapid prototype that you have can be validated against. You can then go to that ideal persona with this piece of documentation in hand, be that a storyboard or a wireframe or a paper wireframe, and then show that to them. And let's say that you don't even need to necessarily identify your end user. You may have an idea of that through your identification of the persona. You can then just talk about this with your team and generate an easy way to make decisions and generate consensus based on this wonderful feedback loop of, oh, here's a prototype. Let's see if our persona wants that. Just keep on iterating on that. From this point, you can basically iterate onto new product ideas, but you can do so with a central point of truth that you know is correct. So validation is actually a really fantastic part of design thinking in this mental model. So in summary today, this is a very straightforward, very simple talk that I just want to drill in your guys' heads because I think it's so valuable. It's also technology agnostic. This can be used on physical products. This can be used on digital products. And overall, it's essentially an emphasis on the human, the end user. Because at the end of the day, all of these functional systems are wonderful, but their final bottleneck is a human being. And that doesn't matter if your target is a developer for some complex backend technology, or whether or not it's a ball that's designed for almost every single person on the planet. No matter what it is, it can benefit from the application of design thinking to validate the idea that you're coming up with and create a more empathetic solution, increasing desirability, that third factor of a great product. So I'll leave you with this. Design thinking is simply user empathy. Put yourself in your user's shoes. Don't just do quantitative analysis. Actually care about these people. Listen to who they are. Try and define their story. Then go ahead and build out that persona that is a mapping of who that person is. Build the user journey, defining their path and optimizing it. Create the mental model that is the metaphor for this valuable experience. And then prototype it. Show it to the end user and validate it. That's design thinking. I guess the question is, how do we talk to users to improve our design? Well, I think that can be multifold. So one, UI and UX are very close twins. And a lot of people in the design community argue like, oh, well, I'm a UI designer, I'm not a user experience designer because they believe that UX is a larger umbrella. I think that UI design is incredibly important in the UX experience, so I find the validity in people who are UI UXs. But I think the key point here is we don't like interfaces. Interfaces are inherently bad, and the less of that we can have, the better. Because essentially it is just this unworkable object that's going to get us to our eventual goal. That's the whole point. The interface is something that we just want to almost entirely remove. So the key there, I think, what I would recommend in that case, for UI, user journeys are very optimal. So mapping out your login and onboarding experience is going to be a really important part of that because you have to really identify what each step is. And if you have too many user inputs, you're going to see drop off, right? So I think just mapping out that onboarding optimization is going to be really important. So it's not even as much about the UI design there as it is about making it as few form fields as possible. So just my recommendation for you is just simply that reduce that cognitive load on the user. Just make sure that just all they have to remember is maybe their username and an individual password, maybe not necessarily like a wallet address or any of these other things. Those need to be more baked into the experience and automated. So whenever possible, try and look for opportunities to automate something and move it into the abstract layer as opposed to being a user control. Because user decisions are good and bad in the way that in the way that the dichotomy of agency and autonomy is good and bad. You want a lot of autonomy, but you don't want too much autonomy because then the computer is going to be solving all of your needs for you and they won't be accurate enough. But you need enough agency. So you need enough agency to decide what you want, but only just enough agency. So hopefully that answered your question a little bit. But I think, yeah, UI needs to go away. Okay, good. All right, thanks, guys.